Hello, everyone. I'm your storyteller, and today I'm here to lead you into the shadows. I know you're using this video to help you sleep, so before we begin, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Lay back comfortably, relax, and let's begin. Part 1. The year was 2018, and the place was a modest apartment building in the heart of New York City. It wasn't luxurious, but for Sam, it was home. At 29, he was a freelance graphic designer who spent most of his time in his one-bedroom apartment. His days were predictable: coffee at 8 a.m., designs until late afternoon, and binging his favorite shows at night. Life was uneventful, just the way he liked it, but that all changed when Mr. Grayson moved in. The elderly man arrived on a rainy Tuesday, wheeling a single suitcase. Sam caught a glimpse of him through his peephole. He was tall and frail, his face pale as if drained of life. When their paths crossed in the hallway later that day, Sam greeted him with a casual, "Hi, welcome to the building." Mr. Grayson didn't respond. He simply nodded, his dark eyes lingering on Sam for a moment too long before shuffling into his apartment. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Mr. Grayson kept to himself, and Sam didn't think much of it. But within a week, strange noises began emanating from the apartment next door. It started as faint tapping, so soft that Sam thought it might be the heating pipes. But as days turned into nights, the sounds grew louder. Footsteps pacing back and forth, muffled whispers, and occasionally a thud that made Sam jump. One night, as he was working late, he heard what sounded like someone calling his name. "Sam." He froze, headphones halfway off his ears. The voice was faint but unmistakable, coming from the wall he shared with Mr. Grayson. He turned off his music, straining to hear more, but the apartment fell silent. The next night, Sam was jolted awake by a sharp knock at his door. He glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. Heart pounding, he approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing. He opened the door slightly, enough to peek into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. A cold draft sent a shiver down his spine. He locked the door, double-checking it before retreating to his bed. Sleep wouldn't come easy that night. By the following weekend, Sam's curiosity got the better of him. He asked his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, if she knew anything about Mr. Grayson. "Grayson?" she said, frowning. "Oh, you mean the man in 4B? Strange fellow. Did you know the last tenant there disappeared? Police couldn't find a trace of her." Sam's stomach dropped. "Disappeared?" Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "Young woman. Nice girl. She just vanished." The information gnawed at him. That night, he decided to investigate. Using a flashlight, he inspected the tiny ventilation shaft in his wall, which led into Mr. Grayson's apartment. As he adjusted the light, his breath hitched. Through the grate, he could see symbols drawn on the walls, circles and strange markings that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. Sam couldn't ignore it any longer. He knocked on Mr. Grayson's door the next morning, determined to get answers. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. When silence persisted, he tried the doorknob. It turned. The apartment was empty. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, like a room sealed for years. The symbols on the walls were more disturbing up close, painted in what looked like dark, dried liquid. The furniture was sparse: a chair, a table, and a bed covered in dust. But what caught Sam's attention was a photo on the table. It was a picture of him taken from the angle of his bedroom window. Panicked, Sam bolted out of the apartment and locked himself in his own. He called the building manager, demanding they investigate, but when they arrived, Mr. Grayson's apartment was spotless. The symbols were gone, the photo missing. That night, Sam tried to stay awake, but exhaustion overcame him. Around 3 a.m., he woke up to the sound of breathing. Close, too close. He turned his head slowly and saw him. Mr. Grayson stood at the foot of his bed, his face unnaturally pale, his mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. "You shouldn't have come into my home," Grayson whispered. Sam screamed, but the figure vanished as if it had never been there. By morning, Sam had packed his things and left the apartment for good. He didn't care about breaking his lease. He just wanted out. A month later, a new tenant moved into 4B, a young woman. Sam saw her once when he returned to retrieve mail. He wanted to warn her, but he couldn't bring himself to. As he walked away, he heard it. Faint tapping from the apartment above, followed by a whisper. "Sam." Part 2. It was the fall of 2017. The days were growing shorter, and the air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter. David, a 35-year-old plumber, had been running his small business for nearly a decade. He was good at his job, meticulous and efficient. Married with 2 kids, He balanced long workdays with evenings filled with soccer games and bedtime stories. Life was predictable until he got the call. The voice on the other end was shaky. An elderly woman named Mrs. Connolly explained that her basement pipes were leaking and needed urgent repair. The job sounded simple enough, and with business slowing as the holidays approached, David agreed to take it. The house was a relic. Built in the early 1900s, it stood at the edge of a quiet street lined with barren trees. When David pulled into the driveway, the overgrown bushes and peeling paint gave the home an eerie feel. Mrs. Connolly greeted him at the door. She was in her 70s, small and hunched, with a wool shawl draped over her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously around the room as she led David inside. "The basement," she said in a whisper. "It's down there." She pointed to a narrow door at the end of the hallway. "Just finish quickly, okay?" David frowned but nodded. Homeowners were often uneasy about strangers working in their homes, so he didn't think much of her tone. He grabbed his tools and headed for the basement. The wooden stairs creaked under David's weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth filled his nose. He reached the bottom and switched on the light. The space was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and jars filled with unidentifiable contents. In the far corner, water dripped steadily from a rusted pipe onto the concrete floor. David set to work, kneeling by the pipe. But as he tightened the wrench, he noticed something unusual. A faint red glow emanated from the opposite corner of the room. He turned, expecting to see a light or maybe an electronic device. There was nothing. The glow seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. As David worked, the basement lights flickered. He glanced up, muttering a curse under his breath. Electrical issues were common in old homes, but the timing was unsettling. Then he heard it, a low hum, almost like a whisper. He froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, but the words were unintelligible, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The humming stopped. David shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Get a grip," he muttered. He returned to the pipe, but his hands were trembling. The light flickered again, this time plunging the room into darkness for several seconds. When it came back on, David's heart stopped. The glow in the corner had intensified. It now illuminated the outlines of something tall and angular, a shadow that didn't belong. David grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the corner. Nothing. The glow disappeared, leaving only the dim yellow of the overhead bulb. He stood, his breathing shallow. "Mrs. Connolly?" he called, climbing halfway up the stairs. No answer. That's when he heard it, the sound of metal scraping against metal. He turned back toward the basement and his blood ran cold. The wrench he'd been using was slowly spinning on the floor as if moved by an unseen hand. Panic set in. David decided he'd had enough. He'd fix the leak another day, or never. Grabbing his tools, he sprinted up the stairs, but when he reached the door, it wouldn't budge. "Come on," he hissed, yanking the handle. A chill swept over him, and the hum returned, louder now. It felt like it was inside his head. The red glow was back, spilling up the stairs like liquid light. David turned to face the basement, and there it was. A figure stood in the middle of the room, tall and shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but two pinpricks of red light pierced through the darkness where its eyes should have been. "Leave," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed, layered with countless others. David stumbled backward, his hand still clutching the door handle. He slammed his shoulder into the wood, and with one final push, the door flew open. Mrs. Connolly was waiting in the hallway, her expression unreadable. What is that thing?" David stammered, his chest heaving. The old woman tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint smile. "They don't like visitors," she said simply. David didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed his bag and fled the house, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing in his ears. David never returned to Mrs. Connolly's home. He ignored her calls, even when she left messages pleading for him to come back. Weeks later, he drove by the house out of curiosity. It looked the same, silent and decaying. But as he stared, he noticed something in the basement window, the faint red glow. Part 3. Ellie had been working the late shift at Moonlight Brew for over 6 months. The quaint coffee shop sat on the corner of a quiet street in London. By day, it was bustling with students and workers, but by night, the energy faded into an eerie stillness. She didn't mind the quiet. At 24, Ellie was used to solitude. She enjoyed the sound of the coffee machine humming and the soft jazz playing in the background. Her shift usually ended at 11 p.m., and most nights were uneventful. But that night, in December 2019, was different. It was 10:50 p.m., and Ellie was wiping down the counters. The shop was empty, save for the warm glow of the hanging lights and the faint steam rising from the espresso machine. She glanced at the clock, counting down the minutes until she could lock up. Then the bell above the door jingled. Ellie looked up to see a man entering. He was tall, with sharp features and an unsettlingly pale complexion. His dark coat was slightly damp, as though he'd been standing in the rain. "Evening," he said, his voice low and smooth. Ellie hesitated. "Hi, we're about to close, but I can take your order if it's quick." The man nodded slowly. "Black coffee, no sugar." Ellie prepared the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. There was something about him, his stillness, his intense gaze, that made her uneasy. When she handed him the cup, he smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ellie." Her heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to her name tag, his smile never wavering. "Oh, right," Ellie said, forcing a nervous laugh. The man sat at a corner table, cradling his coffee but not drinking it. Ellie busied herself with closing tasks, trying to ignore the weight of his presence. She could feel his eyes following her every move. At one point, she glanced toward him and noticed something odd. His reflection in the window was faint, almost translucent. She blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. The clock struck 11. Ellie wiped her hands on her apron and approached his table. "Sorry, but we're closed now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man tilted his head slightly. "You've had a long day," he said, his tone sympathetic. Ellie frowned. "Yes, and I'd like to finish it. Can I?" "You should rest," he interrupted. For a moment, Ellie felt a strange heaviness, as though the air around her had thickened. Then, just as quickly, it passed. Ellie returned to the counter, determined to wait him out. But as she turned to check the coffee machine, she heard a sound, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on a table. She looked over her shoulder. The man was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She walked to the table where he had been sitting, but there was no sign of him. Only the untouched cup of coffee remained. The door was still locked. Then the tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the back room. Ellie grabbed her phone, its dim light barely cutting through the darkness. She stepped cautiously into the back room, her pulse racing. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged through her as she tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A low voice echoed through the room. "Ellie." She spun around, and there he was, the man from the shop. But something was different. His eyes glowed faintly, and his pale skin seemed to shimmer in the dim light. What do you want?" she stammered. He smiled again, wider this time, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "I wanted to see if you'd notice. You're observant, aren't you?" Ellie pressed herself against the door, her mind racing. "Notice what?" "That you've been watched," he said, stepping closer. "Not just tonight, every night." Suddenly the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. Ellie felt her way along the wall, desperate to find the light switch. The man's voice came again, soft and taunting. "You can't escape, Ellie. Not tonight." Her fingers found the switch and she flipped it on. The room was empty. The door creaked open, as if on its own. Ellie bolted out of the shop, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached her apartment, slamming the door behind her. Ellie never returned to Moonlight Brew. She quit the next day, leaving no explanation for her boss. Weeks later, she walked past the shop and glanced inside. It was bustling with customers as though nothing had happened. But in the corner, at the very same table, sat the man in the dark coat. He raised his coffee cup to her, his faint smile sending chills down her spine. And that's the story of the last customer. What would you have done if you were Ellie? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Sleep well, if you can.